Nietzsche has a deep distrust of universalizing systems. For him, there's no reason to say that reason rules the world. Life is essentially irrational, and we couldn't even, if we wanted to, stand outside of life in order to have a totalizing view of it that would allow us to create a philosophical system. So Nietzsche is the first thinker we've read who has an extreme distrust of systems. And on the utility and liability of history for life, Nietzsche suggests that his peers have been focusing way too much on history at the expense of life.
Why are you so obsessed with me?
History should serve life rather than the other way around. So history, for instance, has a limited and yet important use, but it's not the key to understanding human existence, as it might have been for Hegel. Nietzsche suggests that there's a distinction between the ahistorical, which he associates with forgetting and with non-human animal life, and the historical, which is an impulse that humans have developed and has to do with memory. So what sets us apart from non-human animals for Nietzsche is our ability to remember things. And this means, that we can learn from things, that we can create civilizations in a much more sort of robust way than non-human animals can. But it also means that we risk falling into the historical impulse and forgetting the ahistorical impulse. And when we do that, we are not fully living. And we're sort of letting our bodies, our feelings, everything that doesn't get captured through history and reason atrophy. Nietzsche has all these jabs at his compatriots. He talks, for instance, about how his fellow Germans are walking encyclopedias. They are inwardly cultivated, but their knowledge gets them nowhere. They praise content over form. They want to just pack in as much knowledge as they possibly can. They're obsessed with Nietzsche calls instruction versus stimulation. And he says on page 115 that too much history poses dangers to life. 5 dangers in particular. The first is that too much history weakens the personality by producing a dichotomy between the inner and the outer. In cultivating so much the inner side and forgetting the outer side, the human comes to have what Nietzsche calls a weakened personality. We're too busy focusing on how we're going to reflect on our events once they're past to actually experience them in the present. Our day-to-day life is watered down by our obsession with thinking about how it will be recorded, how it will be remembered. Ironically, in our obsession with seeking an artful way of living, we don't live artfully, because living artfully would mean fully investing in our experiences rather than imagining how they might look from the outside, as if they were a movie or a TV show. We become shadows of ourselves rather than living truthfully or authentically. That first danger is pointed out in section 5 of this text. And in section 6, Nietzsche talks about the second danger of an excess of history for life. That second danger is that too much history leads us to think that the present is so much more than the past was. We tend to think that we are better than people who lived in the past. We are more enlightened. We are more advanced. But Nietzsche says, who are we to judge? Why should we say that things have gotten better? Who knows? Maybe they've stayed the same or gotten worse. Nietzsche actually suggests here that not everybody is capable of interpreting the past. And so he has this logic of some individuals being superior to others. This is a very controversial element of Nietzsche's work, where he basically says only from the highest power of the present can you interpret the past. And not everybody is cut out for that. He emphasizes that some people are architects of the future because they are better able to recognize the structure of how things are in relation to how they were. They are not the scholars, but the architects. The third danger of too much history for life is articulated in section 7. And this is the idea that too much history undermines individual instincts and halts the process of maturation. So we're usually kind of cooking as humans, increasingly maturing. But when we focus too much on memory, when we take a sort of distanced approach from the present by thinking, how will I remember this? we actually undermine our instincts and we start to lose touch with ourselves. Nietzsche thinks that children and adolescents have a sort of in-touchness that people are encouraged to lose as they enter society as adults. So for instance, think about the way that a lot of teenagers feel ill at ease in the world, right? They feel out of place. They feel what Nietzsche describes on page 135 as nausea. Nietzsche says that's actually telling us something. These teenagers are not just out of whack and they need to be kind of brought into obedience with the status quo. Their nausea is reflective of the pain and suffering of human existence, especially under certain social conditions that emphasize not living, but having all of this knowledge without ever actually using it. He's particularly worried about the way that the education process generates this. He describes human beings on page 136 as being forced to work in the factory of scholarship and become useful before they are mature. You can probably think about this with respect to your own education process, right? The school system, the university system are set up to encourage instruction. And Nietzsche is very concerned with the way that that emphasis on instruction, with sort of giving people digestible bits of knowledge and filling them up with this, is actually leading them to be profoundly distanced from themselves. The fourth danger of too much history to life, which comes out in section 8, is the idea that we are living in the old age of humanity and history, right? We tend to think of a previous golden age, and we're sort of at the end of history. This idea that there previously was a youth of humanity and now we're living in its old age presupposes a teleological view of history that Nietzsche rejects. And he associates it with Christianity, right? Because Christianity is not only teleological, it's also eschatological. It emphasizes this idea that there will be a second coming of Christ and an end of the world. Nietzsche says here that history is a disguised theology, and he's very concerned with the way that having a progressivist view of history involves certain assumptions that are imported unjustifiably from religion. He has Hegel in mind here, and he has this kind of jab at Hegel on page 143, where he's like, isn't it kind of ironic that for Hegel, the apex and culmination of the world process coincided with his own existence in Berlin? He's like, Hegel, you think that you happen to just be living at the end of history? Do you think there's any chance that that just might be some form of presentism, some form of bias? A bigger issue here is that this notion of history actually fosters obedience among people rather than encouraging them to rebel against oppressive social structures. If you think you're living at the end of history and things are naturally running their course, you don't have a lot of incentive to change things. The fifth danger of too much history for life, which Nietzsche talks about in section 8, is self-irony and cynicism. When we are so obsessed with history at the expense of life, we tend to get really jaded. And he has this great quote on 147 where he says, "Over-proud European of the 19th century, you are stark raving mad. Your knowledge does not perfect nature, but only kills your own nature. Just measure the wealth of your knowledge against the poverty of your own abilities." Too much history makes us feel frustrated because we recognize that there have been great deeds and events in the past, but we feel powerless to enact them in the present. We recognize that we are part of the march of history, but we don't know how, and we don't know how to shape it. We see ourselves as sort of passive bystanders. There's a huge contrast between Nietzsche's conception of history and the one we found in Hegel, obviously, in many respects, but I want to focus on one in particular. Recall that for Hegel, individuals are sort of unwitting puppets of the march of reason in history, right? Whether you're a world historical individual or just an average person, you don't know how you're contributing to world history, but you are in some sense. And you're contributing to it by virtue of your particular historical moment, which will then be sublated in a future historical moment, and so on and so forth. Nietzsche completely gets rid of that. And he says individuals do not further a process. He talks about this a lot on page 151. Rather, individuals live timelessly and simultaneously in something Nietzsche calls the Republic of Geniuses. It's as if geniuses from different periods of time call out to each other and can form relationships, not like literally ones, because a lot of them are dead, but if you live in the present, you can call out to geniuses from previous times and draw inspiration from them, almost to the point that you are in relation to them. Nietzsche says that the purpose of history is to drive these specific individuals to greatness. The goal of humanity is not to be found in a teleological end process, but rather in its, quote, highest specimens. I'm curious what you all think about this because it strikes me as quite a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it may be appealing to think about the individual as being the most important principle of history. On the other hand, Nietzsche, of course, means to say that only a small number of people are individuals. He says the masses mean basically nothing to history. He talks about the vast majority of people as being virtually meaningless and speaks in very derogatory terms of them. So what does Nietzsche trust? Well, he certainly doesn't trust the march of reason throughout history. He certainly doesn't trust systematizing thought. But he does trust the individual, certain individuals specifically. He does trust life, instincts, and youth. He believes that out of those forces come art, come beauty, and that that's the best humans can hope for. For Nietzsche, history must be transformed into a work of art. And individuals do this through what he calls on page 89, shaping power. We help create our own realities and our own histories. I really look forward to discussing with you in Slack the three kinds of history that Nietzsche talks about in this text: the monumental, the antiquarian, and the critical.